The air hung thick and heavy that August afternoon in '78, smelling of diesel fumes and defeat. Jedediah Stone stood by the fence line, his calloused hands resting on a weathered cedar post, and watched them haul away what was left of Bob Henderson's dream. The dream was a Massey Ferguson 1805, a four-wheel drive articulated beast that had been the pride of Henderson's operation just 3 years prior. Now it was a carcass. The bank had taken it, along with the rest of the late-model equipment, and what they couldn't sell at auction was being trucked to the scrapyard in Des Moines. The lowboy groaned under the weight. Rust bled from the seams where the vibrant red paint had blistered and peeled. One of the massive 24.532 tires was flat, its carcass slumped against the rim like a tired old man. The cab glass was shattered on the right side, a spiderweb of cracks telling a story of frustration or vandalism. Jed wasn't sure which. He'd heard Bob had thrown a 3-pound sledgehammer at it the day the papers were served. Jed could understand the sentiment. He watched the truck lumber down the gravel road, kicking up a plume of white limestone dust that settled on his own corn, now browning and drying in the late summer sun. Another one gone. Henderson was the third farmer in their township to go under that year. Third one to bet the farm on high prices and low interest, only to have the bank call the note when the music stopped. A brand-new Ford F-250, a gleaming two-tone of candy apple red and eggshell white, pulled up beside him, crunching gravel under its tires. The window whirred down, an electric sound that seemed alien and out of place in the country quiet. Richard Miller leaned his arm out, a gold watch glinting on his wrist. Rich was 20 years younger than Jed, with a soft face that had never seen a sunburn and hands that looked like they'd never held a wrench. "Sad sight, ain't it, Jed?" Rich said, his voice smooth, a salesman's voice. He'd taken over his father's 500 acres and, in less than a decade, had leveraged it into 2,000. He farmed with a line of credit as long as the Mississippi River. Jed just nodded, his gaze still on the disappearing truck. A man's whole life on the back of that trailer. Rich chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. Bob's mistake was buying used. That Massey was already 5 years old when he got it. Probably had 1,000 hours of abuse on it. You can't run a modern operation with tired iron. Breakdowns kill you. Downtime is death. Jed turned his head slowly, his neck cracking. He looked at Rich, then at Rich's new truck. He knew what sat in Rich's machine shed. A brand new John Deere 8630, the paint so fresh you could still smell it. A 24-row planter, and a 7700 combine with a corn head so wide it had to be escorted down the county blacktop. All of it financed, all of it belonging to the farmer's trust and savings, until Rich paid off a mountain of paper. "Nothing wrong with old iron if you know how to turn a wrench," Jed said, his voice a low rumble, weathered by 60 years of Iowa winters and summer heat. Rich smirked. "That's the thing, Jed. I'm in the business of farming, not running a repair shop. My time is better spent talking to my broker, locking in prices, managing my assets. Not skinning my knuckles on some rusty bolt from a tractor built before I was born." He gestured with his chin towards Jed's own farmstead, nestled in a grove of ancient oaks a quarter-mile down the road. "You're still running that old 4020, aren't you? What is it, a 68? "A 66, synchro range," Jed corrected him, a hint of pride in his voice. "Don't need a power shift when you know how to pick the right gear in the first place." "Whatever you say," Rich said, shaking his head with a look of pity. "Look, I gotta run. Meeting with the loan officer about picking up another quarter section Henderson lost. No rest for the wicked, eh?" The electric window hummed shut, sealing him inside his air-conditioned cab. The Ford roared to life and sped off, leaving Jed in another cloud of dust. Jed stood there for a long time, long after the dust settled. He looked at his own hands. The knuckles were scarred and permanently stained with grease. The nails were thick and yellowed. They were the hands of a man who knew his machinery, not from a brochure, but from the inside out. He could tell by the pitch of the engine if the number 3 injector was getting tired. He could feel a worn bearing through the steering wheel. His empire, if you could call it that, was 320 acres. Half corn, half beans. It wasn't the biggest farm in the county, not by a long shot, but it was his. Every square inch. The deed was in the safe deposit box at the bank, not the loan officer's file cabinet. The machine shed housed his team of old warriors. The '66 John Deere 4020 diesel was his main horse. Its green paint faded to a dull olive on the hood, but the engine, which he'd overhauled himself 2 winters ago, purred like a kitten and pulled like a freight train. Beside it sat a Farmall M his father had bought new in 1951, now used for raking hay and running the grain auger. His combine was a Gleaner F, a simple, reliable machine he'd bought for cash at an auction 10 years back. The community whispered about him. They called him old-fashioned, stubborn, a relic. At the co-op, the younger guys would talk about horsepower and bushels per hour, flashing pictures of their new rigs. Jed would just sip his coffee and stay quiet. They saw his faded tractors and his modest acreage as signs of failure, of a lack of ambition. They didn't see the black ink in his ledger. They didn't see the peace of mind that came with sleeping at night, knowing that no matter what the markets or the weather did, the bank couldn't take a single thing from him. He thought about Rich Miller's words, "Downtime is death." Rich paid top dollar for the dealer's service plan. A breakdown meant a phone call and a shiny service truck showing up in an hour. For Jed, a breakdown meant a trip to his workshop, a dip in the parts washer, and a few hours or days of his own time. Rich saw that as a waste. Jed saw it as independence. Before we go any further into this, I have to ask you folks watching this, take a look in your own sheds, or think about the tools you use for your trade. Have you ever chosen the old, reliable, paid-for tool over the flashy, expensive new one? Let me know down in the comments what piece of old iron you still swear by and why you'll never give it up. I read every single one. Jed turned and walked back toward his farm. The sun was starting to dip lower, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. He had chores to do. The work was never done. As he walked, he could almost hear the ghosts of the men who had farmed this land before him. His father and his grandfather. They had farmed with horses, then with steel-wheeled tractors. They had survived droughts, depressions, and wars, and they had done it by being careful, by saving their pennies, and by never owing any man a single dime they couldn't pay back tomorrow. Jed was just trying to live up to their legacy, in a world that seemed to have forgotten it. The following spring came in wet and miserable. It rained for 3 solid weeks in April, turning the rich black Iowa soil into a thick, impassable gumbo. The fields were lakes, the ditches were rivers. Every farmer in the county was on edge, pacing their living rooms, staring out the window, watching the planting window shrink with every gray, drizzly day. Rich Miller was hit the hardest. His massive, heavy equipment was useless. The day the rain finally broke, he tried to get his 8630 and his 24-row planter into the field. The tractor, weighing close to 20 tons, sank up to its axles in the first 50 feet. Jed watched from his workshop as Rich and 2 of his hired men spent the better part of a day trying to winch it out with another big tractor, which also got stuck. In the end, they had to call the heavy-duty wrecker from the county seat. A bill Jed figured was probably close to $500. The local coffee shop was buzzing with the story. Rich Miller's stuck his new Deere, they'd say, half in sympathy, half in schadenfreude. Too big, too heavy for this ground. Jed waited. He knew his land. He walked the fields every morning, kicking at the dirt, feeling its texture, smelling it. He waited another 4 days after the rain stopped, 4 agonizing days while the sun and the wind worked their magic. The other farmers were running around the clock, mud flying from their tires, desperate to get the seed in the ground. Rich, after his initial disaster, was doing the same, his equipment leaving deep, compacted ruts in his fields that would choke the roots and haunt his yields for years to come. On the 5th day, Jed deemed the soil ready. It was still damp, but it would crumble in his hand instead of sticking like clay. He fired up the 4020. The diesel engine clattered to life with a puff of black smoke, then settled into its familiar rhythmic thrum. He'd spent the rainy weeks tuning it to perfection. He'd rebuilt the carburetor on the Farmall M, replaced a hydraulic line on his old John Deere 4-bottom plow, and sharpened every single disc on his cultivator. He was ready. His planter was an old International Harvester Cyclo 400, only an 8-row. Compared to Rich's 24-row behemoth, it was a toy. But it was light. The 4020, with its narrow tires, practically floated over the soil, leaving barely a track. He worked from sunup to sundown, a steady, unhurried pace. He wasn't setting any speed records, but he also wasn't stopping. He didn't have to pull a planter out of the mud. He didn't have to fix a complex electronic sensor that had shorted out in the damp. One afternoon, he was working a field that bordered one of Rich's. Across the fence, Rich's operation was in chaos. His big planter was down again. Jed could see two men underneath it covered in mud, while Rich yelled into the two-way radio in his tractor cab, his face red with fury. Jed just put the 40-20 in fifth gear, throttled down, and kept on planting, row after perfect row. The scorn from the community was palpable that year. At the grain elevator, waiting in line to unload his beans that fall, Jed found himself parked next to one of Rich's brand-new grain trucks. The driver, a young kid with a smart mouth, leaned out the window. "Hey, Jed," he yelled over the roar of the idling engines. "Heard you had to make 2 trips for every one of ours. Must be tough trying to keep up with that little combine." Jed just smiled a little. "She gets the job done." "Yeah, eventually," the kid sneered. "Rich says you're leaving 20% of your yield in the field with that old thing. Says you're farming for a hobby." Jed didn't reply. He knew his gleaner. He'd set the cylinder speed and the concave clearance just right for the moisture content of his beans. He walked his fields after every pass, checking for losses. He knew for a fact that he was losing less than 2 bushels to the acre. He'd seen Rich's new combine barreling through the field at 7 miles an hour, shelling corn out the back like a broken gumball machine. But he kept his peace. There was no point arguing with a man who confused motion with progress. The struggle was real, though. The longer hours were taking a toll on his 60-year-old body. One night during soybean harvest, well after midnight, a bearing on the main drive of the gleaner's separator went out. It screamed like a banshee and then seized up, plunging the machine into a sudden shocking silence under the bright harvest moon. Any other farmer would have called it a night, called the dealer in the morning. That would have meant at least a day, maybe 2, of downtime waiting for a part and a mechanic. But rain was in the forecast for the day after tomorrow. 2 days of downtime was not an option. Jed climbed down from the cab, his bones aching. He got his tools from the small toolbox he kept bolted to the side of the machine. Working by the combine's headlights, he began the laborious process of tearing the drive apart. The bolts were caked with years of grease and chaff. The pulleys were heavy and awkward. He had to use a 2-foot breaker bar, his muscles straining to get the main nut loose. His hands were soon covered in black, gritty grease. He worked for 4 straight hours, alone in the middle of a 100-acre field. He had a spare bearing in his workshop, one he'd bought years ago at an auction, just in case. By 4 a.m., as the first hint of grey light appeared on the eastern horizon, he had the new bearing pressed in and the drive reassembled. He climbed back into the cab, his body screaming with exhaustion, and turned the key. The engine turned over, and the separator spun to life with a clean, healthy whir. No scream, no grinding. He engaged the header, and the combine lurched forward, swallowing another row of soybeans. He had won. It was a small victory, one that no one else would ever see or appreciate, but to Jed it was everything. It was the difference between independence and dependence. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when things broke, he had the skill and the foresight to fix them himself. He finished the field just as the sun cleared the horizon, a tired but triumphant warrior. The early 1970s arrived like a fever dream for the American farmer. The world was suddenly hungry, and American grain was the answer. President Nixon opened up trade with China. The Russians had a series of disastrous harvests and started buying American wheat and corn in staggering quantities. The Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, became a household name, his voice booming from every radio in the heartland. Plant fence row to fence row, get big or get out. And prices exploded. Corn, which had been bumping along at $1 a bushel, shot up to $2, then $3. Soybeans followed suit. It was the golden age. For men like Rich Miller, it was vindication. Rich went on a buying spree. He bought the Henderson place, then another 80 acres that came up for sale down the road. He traded in his year-old 8630 for the newest model, the 8640, with even more horsepower. He bought a second identical combine so he could run 2 machines during harvest. His line of credit at the bank ballooned, but nobody seemed to care. The loan officer, a man named Henderson, who was no relation to the farmer who'd gone broke, slapped him on the back and called him a visionary. Land values were doubling every few years. The machinery was an asset. The debt was good debt, an investment in an ever-expanding future. Rich built a new house, a sprawling brick ranch set far back from the road, with white columns and a 3-car garage. He bought his wife a new Cadillac. He took vacations to Florida in the winter. At the coffee shop, he was no longer just Rich Miller. He was Mr. Miller, the man with the Midas touch. And he never missed an opportunity to gently mock Jed Stone. "Heard you had a good year, Jed," he'd say, loud enough for everyone at the counter to hear. "Bet you cleared a whole $20,000. Good for you. That ought to keep you in spare parts for that museum of yours for a while." The other farmers would laugh along with him. Jed's years were indeed good. The high prices fell on his modest 320 acres just like they did on Rich's 2,000. But his response was radically different. His input costs were a fraction of Rich's. He had no machinery payments. He had no land payments. He had no hired help. His biggest expenses were fuel, seed, and fertilizer. The windfall he earned in 73 and 74 was shocking even to him. For the first time in his life, he had a substantial amount of cash. His wife, Martha, started dropping hints. She showed him pictures of new kitchens in the farm journal. She talked about how nice it would be to have a new car that didn't smell like oil. She pointed out the new houses the other farm wives were getting. "Jedediah," she said one evening as they sat on the porch swing, "we could afford to expand now. That quarter-section old man Hemmings is looking to sell. Rich Miller's sniffing around it. We could beat his offer. We could finally get a bit bigger." Jed listened patiently, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance over the soybean field. "Martha," he said softly, "bigger ain't always better. We have everything we need right here, and we don't owe a soul for any of it." Instead of buying more land or new equipment, Jed did something that was considered financial suicide in the boom years. He paid down his debt. He took a large chunk of his profits and paid off the last of the mortgage on the farm, a loan his father had taken out 30 years prior. He walked out of the bank on a Tuesday afternoon with the deed in his hand, feeling 10 pounds lighter. He used more of the money to reinforce his position. He bought a used Lincoln arc welder and a cutting torch set for his shop. He built a new weather-tight shed for his grain so he could store his corn and beans on farm and wait for the best prices after the harvest glut. He bought another used fuel tank, filled both of them to the brim with diesel when prices were low. He invested not in expansion, but in efficiency and independence. To everyone else, it looked like he was hoarding his money, burying it in a coffee can in the backyard. They saw a man terrified of success, unable to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. They saw a failure. Jed saw the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, clouds no one else seemed to notice. He listened to the news on the radio every night while he cleaned up his tools in the shop. He heard the reports about the OPEC oil embargo, the gas lines in the cities. He felt the price of everything creeping up. A fan belt that cost $5 last year was $7 this year. A bag of seed corn was 10% more expensive. The word inflation was on the lips of the newscasters every night. One evening in the fall of '79, he was at the co-op picking up a hydraulic filter. The manager, a nervous man named Dave, was on the phone, his voice tight with anxiety. "What do you mean the prime rate went up another point? That's the 3rd time this month. My operating loan is tied to prime. How am I supposed to—" "No, I understand. It's not your fault." Dave hung up the phone and wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead, even though it was cool in the office. He saw Jed standing there. "Can you believe this, Jed?" he said, his voice shaky. "The feds are trying to kill inflation by jacking up interest rates. Paul Volcker. That's the name of the new chairman. They say he's tough as nails. My banker says we could see 20% interest before this is over." Jed nodded slowly, the number settling in his gut like a cold stone. 20%. He thought of Rich Miller with his millions of dollars in loans. He thought of all the other young farmers who had bet everything on cheap money and high prices. Their operating notes, their machinery loans, their mortgages. Many of them were on variable rates. A rate of 20% wouldn't be a hardship. It would be an extinction-level event. He paid for his filter with a crisp $10 bill from his wallet and walked out into the cool autumn air. The sun was setting, casting a golden, almost magical light over the fields of corn stubble. It was the end of a decade of unprecedented prosperity. Everything looked peaceful, everything looked fine. But Jed knew better. He could smell the rain coming. This wasn't a spring shower that would delay planting. This was a hurricane, and it was about to make landfall on the American heartland. He looked toward his own farm, a small debt-free island in a sea of credit, and wondered if it would be strong enough to withstand the flood. The summer of 1980 arrived not with gentle warmth, but with the blast of an open furnace. A brassy, cloudless sky clamped down over Iowa, and for weeks it did not rain. The sun baked the fields, cracking the black soil into a mosaic of deep fissures. Corn leaves, which should have been a vibrant, waxy green, curled in on themselves, turning a sickly yellow-grey, a silent, desperate prayer for water. The air grew thick with a fine haze of dust from the parched fields, a constant irritant in the back of the throat. For Jedediah Stone, it was a time of conservation and hard choices. He cultivated his rows shallow and only at night, trying to break the crust without letting the precious subsoil moisture escape into the relentless sun. His old 40-20, with its narrow tires, tiptoed through the fields, sipping diesel from the tanks he'd filled when fuel was cheaper. He watched his crops struggle, his potential yield shrinking with each passing day, and felt the familiar dull ache of a farmer at the mercy of the weather. For Rich Miller, the drought was a catastrophe of a different order. His vast acreage required vast amounts of everything. His two massive John Deere 8640s, pulling 40-foot field cultivators, burned through diesel at a terrifying rate. The price of fuel had nearly doubled in a year, a direct result of the turmoil in the Middle East. Each pass across his sprawling fields was like setting a pile of $100 bills on fire. Then came the breakdown. It happened in the middle of a blistering July afternoon. Rich was trying to get a head start on chisel plowing some wheat stubble, a desperate attempt to prepare for a fall crop that might save his year. The air conditioning in his 8640, a feature he'd once boasted about as a necessity for modern farming, quit. The cab, a glass box designed to be a climate-controlled command center, instantly became a solar oven. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. Frustrated, he slammed a lever on the hydraulic console a little too hard. There was a pop, a hiss of escaping fluid, and the massive chisel plow behind him dropped to the ground, its shanks digging uselessly into the concrete hard earth. He tried the lever again. Nothing. He checked the gauges. The hydraulic pressure was 0. He radioed his hired man, who brought out 5-gallon buckets of hydraulic fluid, but it was no use. The amber fluid poured into the reservoir and straight out a rupture somewhere deep in the tractor's belly, forming a dark, shimmering pool on the baked ground. The dealer's service truck arrived 2 hours later. A young mechanic in a clean uniform spent an hour crawling under the machine before emerging, covered in oil and dirt. The verdict was grim. A main hydraulic control valve block had cracked. It was a complex, integrated part, not something you could just patch up. "Gotta order one from the factory in Waterloo," the mechanic said, wiping his hands on a rag. "And with the strikes they've been having, could be a week. Maybe 2. 2 weeks? Rich exploded, his face crimson. "I don't have 2 weeks. I'm burning alive out here." The mechanic just shrugged. "The part alone is going to run you about $900, plus labor and the service call. You're looking at $1,500, easy." $1,500, and 2 weeks of downtime. Rich stood in the oppressive heat, staring at his $500,000 machine, as useless as a boulder, and felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The price of progress, he was discovering, was paid not just in monthly installments, but in crippling helplessness. A few days later, the news got worse. To punish the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan, President Carter had announced an embargo on grain sales. The market, which had been the foundation of the entire agricultural boom, collapsed overnight. The price of corn plummeted from $3 a bushel to barely $2. Soybeans followed. Suddenly, the numbers on Rich's balance sheet, which had always seemed theoretical and manageable, became terrifyingly real. The loans he'd taken out were based on $3 corn. The payments were calculated for it. With the price cut by a third, his projected income was slashed, but the payments to the bank remained the same, a fixed, unyielding demand. The first cracks in his empire appeared as whispers at the co-op. A fuel delivery driver mentioned that Rich's account was on a cash-only basis. A seed salesman quietly told a friend that Rich's check for his spring seed had bounced. The loan officer Henderson, who used to greet Rich with a hearty handshake, now seemed to be busy whenever Rich called. The friendly letters from the bank were replaced by stark, formal notices with red ink in the margins. Jed saw it all. He saw the weeds starting to take over the edges of Rich's fields, a sign of a man too broke or too busy to spray. He saw one of Rich's new grain trucks sitting idle for weeks, a flat tire sagging on the rim. He saw Rich himself, looking thinner, his face etched with lines of worry that hadn't been there 6 months before. One evening, Jed was in his shop, grinding a new edge on a plowshare, the shower of orange sparks illuminating the quiet space. He heard a vehicle pull into his lane. It was Rich's F-250, but it was covered in a thick layer of dust, the candy apple red paint looking dull and tired. Rich got out and walked slowly toward the open shop door, not with his usual swagger, but with the hesitant gait of a man walking into a church. He held a small, greasy part in his hand. "Jed," he said, his voice quiet, almost hoarse. "My auger motor, the one on my bin. It quit. I think it's the brushes. The dealer wants $75 for a new set, and I can't." He looked down at the part in his hand, then up at Jed. "I heard you know how to rebuild these things." Jed shut off the grinder, the sudden silence ringing in his ears. He looked at Rich, at his soft hands now smudged with grease, at the desperation in his eyes. He saw not the arrogant tycoon who had mocked him, but just another farmer in trouble. "Let's have a look," Jed said, taking the motor housing. He gestured with his chin toward the house. "Martha just made a fresh pot of coffee. Go on up and have a cup. This'll take me a little while." Rich hesitated, then nodded, a flicker of profound relief crossing his face. As he walked toward the house, Jed took the small electric motor to his workbench. He knew he had a set of brushes that would fit, salvaged from an old generator years ago. They were in a dusty jar labeled spares. The cost to him was nothing but a few minutes of his time. As he carefully disassembled the motor under the bare bulb of his work light, he felt no sense of triumph, only a deep and abiding sorrow for what was happening to them all. The dam broke in the winter of 1981. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their relentless war on inflation, pushed the prime interest rate to an unimaginable 21.5%. For the farmers drowning in variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. An operating loan that cost 8% a few years ago now demanded more than double that. Machinery payments ballooned. Mortgages became unpayable. It was a complete and total economic collapse, a financial heart attack sweeping across the plains. The same bankers who had pushed the loans, who had encouraged the expansion, now turned into cold-eyed executioners. Their own survival depended on calling the notes of their most vulnerable clients. The classified section of the county newspaper, once filled with ads for new equipment, became a grim ledger of foreclosure auctions. The Henderson farm, the Peterson farm, the Miller farm. Rich Miller's auction was scheduled for a cold, blustery Saturday in March. The sky was the color of lead, spitting a miserable mix of sleet and rain. A crowd of 100 or so people gathered in Rich's meticulously landscaped yard, their boots turning the frozen grass into a muddy soup. They were mostly other farmers, their faces grim, their eyes darting around nervously. They weren't there as vultures, but as mourners at a funeral, acutely aware that it could easily be their own farm on the auction block next month. Jed stood at the back of the crowd, his hands deep in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket. He watched as the auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a practiced, insincere smile, began to sell off a man's life, piece by piece. The shop tools went first, for pennies on the dollar. Then the household items, Martha Miller's furniture carried out of the sprawling brick house and sold off in the rain. Rich and his wife stood on the porch, huddled together like refugees, their faces pale and blank with shock. Rich's gaze was fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon, as if he couldn't bear to watch. Then the auctioneer moved to the big items. The gleaming John Deere 7700 combines, less than 5 years old, sold for less than half of what Rich had paid for them. The massive planters and tillage equipment followed, each sale a hammer blow, each price a testament to the collapsed economy. Finally, they came to the tractors. The flagship, the John Deere 8640 that had been Rich's pride, was driven up onto a slight rise. Its tires were caked with mud. The spot where the hydraulic valve had been replaced was still clean, a small scar on the underbelly of the beast. "All right, folks, here she is," the auctioneer bellowed. The top of the line, 4-wheel drive, power shift, sound guard cab. "Who'll start the bidding at $50,000? $50,000. It's worth double that." Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling through the bare branches of the oak trees. $50,000 was an impossible sum. No one had that kind of cash, and no bank was lending it. "40,000, the auctioneer pleaded, his voice losing its confident ring. "Give me 40, 30. The crowd was a sea of stone faces. Finally, a man from a large corporate farm, 2 counties over, offered 25. The auctioneer tried desperately to get another bid, his eyes scanning the crowd, but no one moved. "Sold," he finally yelled, slamming his gavel down, "for $25,000 to the man in the green cap." Jed watched the corporate farmer walk over and hand a check to the bank representative, a young man in a suit who shivered in the cold. Jed felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. That machine, which had represented the pinnacle of modern farming, had lost over 70% of its value in a few short years. It hadn't been an asset. It had been an anchor, pulling Rich down into the depths. Through it all, Jed's own farm continued, an island of stability in the raging storm. His year was hard, the profits razor-thin due to the low prices, but there were profits. He had no payments to make. His fuel tanks were still half full of cheaper diesel. He sold his stored grain from the previous year when the price ticked up for a few weeks in January. A small bump that most leveraged farmers missed because they'd been forced to sell right out of the field at harvest time to satisfy the bank. He and Martha lived simply, as they always had. They ate from their garden, heated their small farmhouse with wood he cut from his own timber lot. One afternoon, Martha found him in the shop, carefully tapping a new seal into the water pump of the 4020. "How are we doing, Jed?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Really doing?" Jed wiped his hands on a red rag and looked at her. "We're all right, Martha. We're not getting rich, but the farm is safe. We're going to make it through." She put her hand on his shoulder, her touch a comfort he had relied on for 40 years. "I was wrong," she said softly. "All those years I wanted a new kitchen, a bigger farm. I was wrong. You saw this coming, didn't you?" Jed looked at the old green tractor, its faded paint a testament to decades of work. "I didn't see this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Not all of it. But my father always said, don't ever bet what you can't afford to lose. These fellas, they bet the whole farm. The bank encouraged it. The government encouraged it. And now they're all just walking away, leaving these boys to face the music alone." He picked up his hammer, his knuckles white. "It ain't right." The auctioneer moved on to the final, most painful part of the sale, the land itself. Rich Miller's 2,000 acres were being broken up and sold in parcels. The crowd thinned out. Most of the local farmers couldn't afford to even dream of buying land. The only bidders left were the out-of-town corporations and a few wealthy investors looking to pick up farmland at bargain basement prices. Parcel by parcel, Rich's empire was dismantled. The Henderson place he had bought with such pride was sold to a syndicate from Chicago. The quarter section he'd picked up from the Hemmings estate went to an insurance company. Finally, the auctioneer announced the last parcel. Lot number 12, the original Miller Home 80. 80 acres, includes the house, the barns, and the machine shed. This was the heart of it all. The land Rich's grandfather had homesteaded. The ground his father had farmed his entire life. Jed saw Rich flinch, a sharp, involuntary jerk, as if he'd been struck. His wife, Martha, began to cry silently, her shoulders shaking. The bidding started low. The house was too big, the barns too old for the corporate buyers. They wanted bare land they could tear the fences out of and farm in massive tracts. The bidding stalled at a pitifully low number, an insult to the generations of work that had been poured into that soil. Jed, who had been silent all day, took a step forward. The crowd parted slightly, surprised to see him move. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, cutting through the wind. "I'll bid $100 more," he said. The auctioneer's head snapped in his direction. The corporate man in the green cap looked over, annoyed. He raised his hand. "Another 500. "Another 500 on top of that," Jed said immediately, his eyes not on the auctioneer, but on Rich. They went back and forth, the bids climbing in small increments. The corporate man was bidding with a checkbook. Jed was bidding with the cash he had carefully saved over the good years, the money he hadn't spent on new iron or a bigger house. He knew his limit. He knew exactly what he had, and what this piece of land was worth, not in dollars, but in dignity. Finally, the price reached a point just beyond the land's devalued market price, but still a fraction of what it had been worth 5 years ago. The corporate man hesitated, did some quick math on a notepad, and shook his head. "Going once," the auctioneer called, looking at Jed. "Going twice, sold, to Jedediah Stone." A quiet murmur went through the remaining crowd. Jed Stone, the old-timer, the man they'd all dismissed as a relic, had just bought the Miller homestead. Jed ignored them. He walked to the clerk's table, his back straight, and wrote out the check from his worn checkbook. He didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. Later that afternoon, after the crowds had gone and the only thing left was the muddy, rutted lawn and a profound silence, Jed walked over to the porch where Rich and his wife still sat, as if frozen in place. He held out a piece of paper. It wasn't the deed. It was a simple, one-page rental agreement. "The rent is a third of the crop, just like in the old days," Jed said, his voice gentle. "You can stay, you can farm it. The house is yours. Your father was a good neighbor to my father. This is the least I can do." Rich looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a confusion that slowly gave way to a dawning, incredulous hope. He couldn't speak. He just took the paper from Jed's calloused hand, his own trembling. The years that followed were lean, but they were healing. The farm crisis slowly receded, leaving a scarred but resilient landscape. The community's perception of Jedediah Stone underwent a profound transformation. He was no longer the stubborn old man who was afraid of progress. He was the one who had survived. He was the one who had been right. Younger farmers, the ones who had managed to hang on by the skin of their teeth, started stopping by his workshop. They didn't ask about leveraging assets or marketing strategies. They asked him how to weld a cracked frame, how to time an old diesel engine, how to get by when money was tight. Jed would always stop what he was doing, wipe the grease from his hands, and share what he knew, patiently and without judgment. He became the unofficial elder of the township, his wisdom sought, his quiet strength admired. Rich Miller took Jed's offer. He farmed the home 80 acres with borrowed equipment, working harder than he ever had in his life. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He and Jed became unlikely friends, bonded by the shared love of the land. Rich learned how to turn a wrench, how to make do, how to find pride not in the size of his operation, but in a straight furrow and a clean harvest. Life settled into a new rhythm for Jed. He never expanded beyond his 320 acres. He bought a slightly newer, but still used, John Deere 4440 in the late 80s. Paying cash, the old 4020 was semi-retired, used only for light-duty work, a trusted old soldier enjoying a well-earned rest. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Jed was in his shop, the familiar smells of oil and steel hanging in the air. His grandson, a boy of about 12 with bright, curious eyes, was with him. The boy was watching Jed carefully adjust the valves on the Farmall M. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why do we still use these old tractors? My friend's dad has a new one. It has a computer in it, and a TV." Jed tightened a lock nut and then turned to face the boy, a slow smile creasing the corners of his eyes. He leaned against the red fender, the metal cool against his back. "This tractor," he said, patting the faded paint, "has taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about how fast you can go or how big you can get. It's about what you own and what owns you." He looked past the boy, out the open door of the machine shed. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the corn stubble. The fields were his. The machines were his. The house, the barns, the very ground beneath his feet. It was all his. No bank, no corporation, no government program had a claim on any of it. It was an empire built not on debt and credit, but on sweat, patience, and the simple, profound freedom of being beholden to no one. "That new tractor with the computer is fine," Jed continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But when you owe the bank for it, every time you turn the key, you're working for them. When I turn the key on this old thing," he reached over and patted the steering wheel, "I'm working for us. For your grandma, for you. There's a difference. Never you forget that." The boy nodded, not quite understanding the depth of the words, but sensing their importance. He looked at the old tractor, then at his grandfather's scarred, capable hands, and he knew he was looking at something true and lasting. Jed stood there, a patriarch in his small kingdom of paid-for steel and debt-free land, content, at peace, his legacy not in the size of his acreage, but in the quiet, unshakable strength of his independence.